Hi, Chestnut Grove. This is Pastor Andy Gathman, and we're continuing our How to Pray series. This is Lesson 7, The Sound of Silence. If you're finding us on YouTube, you might want to click on the link below, which will take you to our website where you'll find some additional resources. Today's topic is silent prayer. And before we get into silent prayer specifically, I thought we'd just begin by talking about silence in general. And I wanted to ask you to think about, how are you with silence? You know, silence is something that can be a relief on the one hand, particularly when we're dealing with noises around us, dealing with distractions. But at the same time, I think silence can also be unsettling. We live in a world filled with sensory input. In fact, our brains really are sensory input machines. We're constantly evaluating and receiving that input and trying to sort through it. And when we don't have that kind of input, it can be uncomfortable. We don't know how to respond a lot of times. And we're left with our own thoughts or our own feelings, things that, when you're in the midst of watching TV or scrolling through your phone or reading your email or watching Netflix, you don't have time or even really the opportunity to think or recognize what's going on under the surface. So in that sense, silence itself can be challenging to enter into. I know for me, every year I go on vacation at a lake up in central Pennsylvania. And one of the things about this lake is that there's not good cell reception. And so for most of the week, I put away my cell phone. And it takes me a while to acclimate to the level of silence, not just the sounds of silence in this rural lake, but also just sort of the lack of input. And yet what we find in Scripture is that it's in the midst of silence that God often finds a way to speak to us. And if prayer is in fact communion with God, if that's one of the main principles we've been talking about through this whole series, if communion with God is what prayer is really all about, then in a lot of ways, silence as a way of giving God an opportunity to speak to us is a really important, you might even say essential, part of prayer. I'd like to share two passages from Scripture that help draw out this point. And the first is from 1 Kings chapter 19. And it's when the prophet Elijah has been running away from really persecution. The king and queen of Israel at the time were really angry at Elijah because he was calling them out for their idol worship. And so they were pursuing him, and Elijah ran away to the desert, really effectively so that he could go off by himself and die. But in the desert, God sends an angel, and the angel tells him to go to the mountain of God. And there Elijah waits in a cave. The word of the Lord came to Elijah saying, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle, and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. There came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" You can imagine Elijah's ordeal. It was quite desperate. And the signs of power that he felt in the wind, in the earthquake, in the fire, no doubt were very frightening and awe-inspiring. But God wasn't to be found in those demonstrations of power. No, God was discovered in the silence that came after. And God met Elijah with a searching question. What are you doing here? What are you here for, Elijah? It's often in these moments of silence, whether they're preceded by great turmoil or just through the space that we make for ourselves, that we in fact are able to hear from God, to cut through the noise in our life, the noise in our hearts, the noise in our minds, and be able to discover something real about ourselves because God is able to speak. Another place we see this is in Psalm 139, which is a great psalm about how God is present with us throughout our whole lives. And in this psalm, the psalmist begins saying, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways." The psalmist begins to imagine the different moments of their life, where they might go, what might happen to them, and would God still be there? Would God be with me at the far end of the sea? Would God be with me if I make my bed in the depths? Was God with me even when I was in my mother's womb? And the psalmist considers all those things and says, yes, even in those extreme cases and spaces, even then God is with me. And the psalm resolves by the psalmist inviting God's presence. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See if there is any wicked way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. You see, it's the presence of God in the interior spaces of our lives. God searching us, helping us to understand ourselves, helping us to get in touch with those deep inner places that really enables us to commune with God and to commune with our own souls. And silent prayer opens the door to that kind of experience. As unsettling and as uncomfortable as silence can be, nonetheless, it's in those silent moments and through silent prayer that we discover that place in our own hearts where God's Spirit lives. And we open ourselves to hear from God, to hear the questions, to hear the messages, just even to be comforted by the reality of God's presence. I hope this has helped you to understand some of the benefit of silent prayer, to encourage you to try it out. And in the next video, I'm going to show you how to practice it.